60% of Americans are opposed to Trump's tariffs. And of course, there was all this news coming out of the World Series, right? Canada tariffs. We're not just talking China, we're talking Canada and tariffs.
As many as 60% of Americans expressed opposition to Trump's trade policy, the sharpest drop in approval for any of his flagship programs since returning to the White House. What makes this result even more striking is the source of the backlash. It didn't come from traditional rivals like China or Mexico, but from Canada, a country long regarded as America's most reliable and closest friend. In the fall of 2025, after a commercial in Ontario mocked Trump's "Make America Great Again" economic message, the president retaliated by imposing a 10% tariff on all Canadian imports. The move, which he claimed was a show of strength, quickly revealed the fragility of his political standing. Americans did not rally behind him as expected. Instead, they reacted with confusion and disappointment. Many asked, why would their president choose to punish a friendly neighbor, America's most important economic partner and security ally? The numbers don't lie. Trump's tariff policy is shaking public confidence, and its aftershocks are spreading beyond Washington's political arena, affecting the economy, jobs, and the once inseparable relationship between the two countries.
So the bottom line is this: if I were advising President Donald John Trump when it comes to his policies, I'd say step off the tariffs, at least from a political point of view, because the bottom line is it doesn't sell with the American people.
Public support for Donald Trump is fracturing at an astonishing pace. In late 2020, most Americans still believed tariffs were an effective tool to protect the economy. At the time, polls showed 52% in favor and 48% opposed. But just 5 years later, the picture has completely reversed. By October 2025, 6 in 10 respondents surveyed by CNN and Gallup said they opposed Trump's trade policies. Only about 1/3 of Americans still supported imposing tariffs on Canadian goods. The wave of disappointment cuts across social and political lines. Working-class families complain about the rising cost of living, while business owners argue that tariff-induced uncertainty is suffocating investment. Economists once saw tariffs as a temporary fix. Now voters view them as a lingering burden. The promise to make America win again rings hollow when grocery prices soar and manufacturing jobs remain elusive. Even within Trump's own base, cracks are showing. Factories in Michigan, farms in Iowa, and retail businesses in Pennsylvania, regions that helped return him to the White House, are now facing canceled contracts and shrinking profits. The once proud symbol of American economic strength that Trump championed has turned into a case study in disorder and discontent. The very policy that lifted him to power is now dragging him down. The turning point came when Trump chose to target Canada. Against China, Americans could rationalize his actions as part of a strategic rivalry. But against Canada, a friendly neighbor and long-standing ally, the move was seen as petty, even personal. According to CNN data, Canada enjoys a +49 favorability rating among the American public, while Trump's approval on trade sits at -10. To Americans, Canada is not just an economic partner, it's a trusted friend, a nation of decent and courteous people. Thus, every time Trump attacks Ottawa, he isn't merely challenging Canada's government, he's insulting the positive image Americans associate with the country. Worse still is the economic backdrop. As the United States struggles with stagnant growth and persistent inflation, voters are running out of patience for meaningless confrontations. They look north and see stability, cooperation, and mutual respect, qualities seemingly absent from Washington's current policies. For many, tariffs against Canada have become less an economic issue than a question of judgment and leadership. A president who cannot tell friend from foe is no longer seen as a defender of national interests, but as a disruptor clinging to power. The result is growing political isolation. Americans now trust Canada more than their own leader on trade, and that simple comparison, +49 favorability for Canada versus -10 for Trump, speaks volumes about why his tariff strategy has become an irreparable mistake. If opposition to Donald Trump is surging in the United States, the reaction in Canada marks a historic turning point. Just 2 years ago, in 2023, only 7% of Canadians viewed the US as a threat. By mid-2025, that number had soared to 48%, according to data from the Pew Research Center. Nearly half of Canadians now see their southern neighbor not as a trusted partner, but as a potential source of risk. This is more than anger. It's a shift in national mindset. The sense of security that had been nurtured for decades through friendship with Washington is steadily fading. Canadian media now openly describe the US as an increasingly unstable and unpredictable power. From Prime Minister Mark Carney to provincial leaders, many are publicly discussing the creation of new trade routes across Asia and Europe, rather than continuing to rely on a fickle partner. The cultural gap between the two countries is also widening. A survey by the Environics Institute shows Canadian national pride reaching a record high, fueled by a growing desire for independence and self-determination. For the first time in decades, Canadians no longer measure their prosperity by alignment with American policy. While Americans still hold a warm view of Canada, Canadians have stopped believing that this admiration is mutual. The emotional bond that once formed the foundation of North American relations is gradually giving way to caution, and to a simmering sense of resentment. In the United States, the political cost of Donald Trump's tariff policy is becoming increasingly evident. Democratic lawmakers in Congress describe his trade program as a self-inflicted wound. Brendan Boyle, a Pennsylvania congressman and senior member of the House Budget Committee, emphasized that 40% of U.S. trade depends on three key partners: Canada, Mexico, and China. When one of them is punished, the entire economy feels the ripple effects. He warned that tariffs only drive up living costs and stall investment, an observation that recent public opinion surveys have confirmed. Independent voters now associate tariffs with inflation, while small businesses call them a hidden tax. Even within the Republican Party, many lawmakers acknowledge that Trump's tax cuts and massive spending have failed to deliver results, instead widening the federal deficit and reinforcing the perception that the government favors the wealthy. Meanwhile, another government shutdown looms as divisions within the party deepened. Moderate Republican voices are warning that voters in border states like Michigan and New York are running out of patience as exports decline and local businesses suffer. Put simply, Trump's promise of economic nationalism has turned into a domestic burden. What was once hailed as a symbol of strength on the global stage now reflects weakness in domestic governance. While Washington continues to criticize Ottawa, the Canadian government has quietly pivoted its strategy, expanding partnerships across Asia, signing new investment frameworks with ASEAN, and reviving trade dialogues with the European Union. The goal is clear: to diversify economic relationships before dependence becomes a vulnerability. During his visit to Malaysia in October, Prime Minister Mark Carney outlined Canada's new vision, one rooted in sustainable growth, rules-based cooperation, and trusted partnerships. That message resonated across Asia, making it clear that Canada is ready to step out of Washington's shadow. Canada's change in direction is not an act of defiance or rebellion, but a form of survival through adaptation. In less than a year, Ottawa has skillfully positioned the country as a bridge between the Western world and the emerging economies of Asia. The core of this strategy rests on three pillars: energy, technology, and strategic minerals, sectors widely seen as the keys to the global future. While the Trump White House remains preoccupied with tariff rates and trade barriers, Canada is focused on expanding investment and forging long-term partnerships. The contrast between the two approaches could not be starker. One builds walls, the other builds bridges. For Canadians, this new path is not just an economic strategy, it is an expression of autonomy and confidence. For Americans, it serves as a reminder that power built on punishment has its limits. The neighbor once dismissed as a junior partner is now acting like an equal ally, and in some areas, even pulling ahead. The tariff gamble of Trump's second term, designed to prove that economic power could restore political influence, has instead exposed the fragility of both nations. Public trust in the US government has eroded, while Canadians have grown more wary. The friendship that once anchored relations between the two countries now faces its greatest test in decades. The numbers tell the story. 60% of Americans oppose Trump's tariff policy, and nearly half of Canadians view the United States as a threat. These are not just abstract statistics, they are evidence that the emotional and moral ties once binding the two nations are breaking down. Tariffs, once promoted as tools to strengthen America, have instead deepened social divisions. They were meant to command respect from allies, but have led many nations to question the judgment of the US administration. In politics, power comes not only from strength, but from persuasion. And when a leader turns his closest friend into an adversary, the message to the world could not be clearer. The greatest threat to the United States does not come from abroad, but from its own obstinacy.
Millions of people across the U.S. and cities around the world took part in a new round of No Kings protests this weekend. The mass movement, spanning more than 2,500 demonstrations, drew massive crowds. Demonstrators are calling for an end to what they describe as authoritarian rule, accusing President Donald Trump of abusing his power.
Across the United States, millions have taken to the streets, hoisting banners bearing a defiant slogan: "No thrones, no crowns, no kings." The No Kings movement has rapidly become the most powerful wave of resistance against President Donald Trump's second-term agenda. What began as a small protest group in June has now grown into more than 2,500 coordinated demonstrations across major cities worldwide. Their message is unmistakable: America will not tolerate any form of authoritarianism. But these protests are about more than politics. They reflect a nation buckling under economic and social strain. Behind the chants and the chaos lies the reality of an economy weighed down by tariffs, inflation, and a federal government paralyzed by a prolonged shutdown. Increasingly, Americans are realizing that Trump's once galvanizing slogan, "America First," is collapsing under its own weight. While Washington tightens its grip on control, Ottawa is quietly repositioning itself. The Canadian government is turning restraint into a strategic tool, methodically demonstrating that Trump's economic gamble may collapse under the extremity of his own approach. The protests in the U.S. did not erupt in a vacuum. They are the inevitable result of a nation stretched to its breaking point. The United States has now entered its fourth government shutdown in 6 years. As Congress remains bitterly divided over spending, healthcare, and immigration, hundreds of thousands of federal workers are on unpaid furlough. Agencies are grinding to a halt, and working families face growing uncertainty. Meanwhile, the economy Trump once boasted was unbeatable is beginning to lose momentum. According to the International Monetary Fund, IMF, U.S. GDP growth in 2025 is expected to reach only about 2%, a modest figure masking deep instability. The budget deficit has ballooned to 6.5% of GDP, while foreign investors are pulling out of the US dollar. Gold prices have surged to a record $4,300 per ounce, reflecting fears that America's public debt is no longer considered a safe asset. Political discontent and economic anxiety are now merging into a single, unprecedented wave of anger. Critics argue that Trump's power ambitions, from meddling with the Federal Reserve and pressuring the media to weaponizing tariffs as a political tool, have eroded America's most precious asset: stability. The No Kings movement captures that sentiment, a society demanding transparency and accountability from an increasingly autocratic administration. Even among conservatives, unease is growing. Business associations that once praised Trump's protectionist agenda now warn that the tariff wave is driving up consumer prices and choking trade. Farmers across the Midwest have lost key export markets and face the bleak prospect of harvests with no buyers. Amid America's deepening divisions, the image of protesters holding No Kingsman signs has become more than a symbol of defiance. It is a warning from a nation at risk of losing what once defined its strength: its ability to unite, to empathize, and to correct its own mistakes. While Donald Trump continues to project confidence, sentiment on Wall Street has shifted from optimism to caution, a clear signal that the economic foundation once seen as his greatest asset is starting to crumble. North of the border, the trade war is also sparking vigorous debate across Canada. The decision by Stellantis and Jeep to relocate their production line from Brampton, Ontario to Illinois has cost nearly 3,000 Canadian workers their jobs, while creating about 5,000 new positions in the U.S., a symbolic victory for Trump's Bring Manufacturing Home campaign. However, rather than responding in kind, Prime Minister Mark Carney's government has chosen a markedly different path. Instead of retaliating with new tariffs, Ottawa quietly removed dozens of countervailing duties on imports from both the United States and China. A more than 100-page decree lifted tariffs on steel, aluminum, and various industrial goods, a move that angered some domestic industries but signaled a deliberate shift from confrontation to cooperation. In doing so, Canada is once again positioning itself as the calm counterpoint to America's turmoil, showing that strength in the modern world may lie not in retaliation, but in restraint. Carney's team argues that in today's fragile global environment, escalating trade tensions is tantamount to shooting oneself in the foot. Canada's objective, according to officials, is to preserve market stability, safeguard supply chain access to the United States, and prepare for the 2026 review of the USMCA agreement. Speaking publicly, Carney was brief but pointed. There are moments that call for a strong response, and others that call for dialogue. Behind that calm statement lies a long-term strategy, turning patience into a tool of power. While Trump raises tariffs to apply pressure, Ottawa deliberately projects composure, positioning itself as a stabilizing anchor in a region defined by volatility. That image is drawing global attention. Across Europe and Asia, policymakers are viewing Canada's approach as a model for middle-sized economies caught between American pressure and the imperatives of globalization. Rather than engaging in confrontation, Ottawa is leveraging stability and predictability as diplomatic assets, building investor confidence at a time when Washington is mired in political turmoil. For Carney, this may be the defining test of his foreign policy vision. Even some of Trump's former trade advisors, such as Kellyanne Shaw, have admitted that the upcoming deal between the two countries could be a better agreement, though the phrase now carries an entirely different meaning. Instead of symbolizing American dominance, it reflects Canada's resilience and strategic finesse. In practice, Trump's logic is backfiring. Tariffs on steel, aluminum, and trucks, intended to revive U.S. manufacturing, have instead driven up production costs, forcing automakers to rely once again on supplies from Canada and Mexico.